This week, the minority leader is beginning to suggest that there may be, as a solution, temporary solution, an agreement on the debt ceiling that's only temporary and leaving more time for the negotiations. Would you support that?
I don't really want to deal in hypotheticals. I mean, it's just sad, again, the fact that we're sitting here a month and a half before the point in time where Treasury Secretary Geithner said, this is the drop dead date, and now the administration is only now starting to step up the plate and starting to hold more frequent talks. That might be necessary. I certainly don't want to vote for any increase in the debt ceiling until we actually solve the problem. And from my standpoint, the way you solve the problem is you have got to establish a discipline. That's why I co-sponsored the CAP Act. That would be a statute that puts us on a glide path toward eventually balancing the budget. I would also support a constitutional amendment. My preference is one that just matches the CAP Act and actually limits spending. But until we put those very hard controls on the political process here in Washington, I just don't see anybody stepping up the plate on the other side to actually solve the problem. There just isn't the political will. There's a lot of demagoguery. The people like Paul Ryan that have put forward a plan, they get slaughtered. I mean, Chuck Schumer, he laid out their plan, just pointed at the Republicans and called them extreme. And that doesn't solve the problem. Producing commercials where you have a Paul Ryan lookalike throwing Granny off the cliff, that doesn't solve the problem. We need people coming to the table in good faith. And Susan, I'm willing to work with anybody who will seriously address this problem and work with us in good faith.
Since you're calling for negotiations, do you have any so-called lines in the sand, things that are off the table for you? Will you accept tax increases? Are you willing to look at military spending?
Oh, absolutely. We have to, everything has to be on the table in terms of spending. My problem with tax increases is one just from a standpoint of facts and figures. I don't think it works. I mean, we have a very weak economy, and I think the last thing you want to do is increase taxes. We need increased revenue, but we need to increase revenue, I always say the old-fashioned way, by growing our economy. So whatever solution we come up with needs to really be a pro-growth agenda. I am all for a complete overhaul of our tax system, complete tax reform. Our tax code is 70,000 pages. I've seen estimates that it costs anywhere from $200 billion to $338 billion just to comply with our tax code. Now, to put that in context, we raised this year, we'll probably get $2.2 to $2.5 trillion in revenue. $338 billion is almost 15% of those receipts. That's ridiculous. It creates so many uneconomic decisions on the part of business people and part of consumers. We really do need tax reform. And I guess one piece of good news is I think people on both sides of the aisle recognize that fact. Recognize that our corporate tax structure is not competitive, which isn't good. I mean, it's not whether we have a choice to compete in the global economy. We have to compete. We have to recognize that. So we have to benchmark our tax rates, our tax regimen, our regulatory environment. We have to benchmark that against the rest of the countries in the world so that we have an attractive place for global capital to come and invest.
You brought a chart along with us. I'm going to put it under the screen. I'm going to ask you to explain why this is important to you. Well,
I think it was 3 weeks ago, I sent a letter. It was signed by 22 of my Republican Senate colleagues. And basically, I first of all called on the President to get engaged and really develop the real solution to the problem. But barring that, I was also very concerned. Treasury Secretary Geithner was out there, I think, trying to scare the markets, scare the American people. And basically, his quote was, if they don't get, their plan was to get an increase in the debt ceiling. Their fallback plan was to get an increase in the debt ceiling. And their fallback plan was to get an increase in the debt ceiling. Now again, I'm new here. I've seen how broken this place is from afar, and trust me, now that I'm here, this place is broken. Not passing a budget in the Senate in 2 years, I think that's pretty good evidence of that. So my point was, I don't think this administration should assume they're going to get an increase in the debt ceiling. And my point is, it doesn't have to be a crisis if we don't get an increase in the debt ceiling, if we plan for it. That's what families do. That's what businesses do every day. And let's face it, businesses frequently face a situation where they may lose a big customer. They have to really cut back on expenditures. So the point of my chart here is, one thing I've noticed in Washington is people talk an awful lot about cuts off a baseline and, I mean, percentage increases, percentage decreases. Nobody actually looks at the real numbers. So I thought I'd put together a chart that just shows the real numbers.
Essentially, contingency budget.
Contingency budget, but also trying to lay out for the American people what's happened. So on that chart, I don't know if it's on the screen, what you see is 10 years ago, under President Bill Clinton, our total federal expenditures were $1.8 trillion. Now, in just 10 years, we've doubled that to $3.7 trillion. The Ryan Plan calls for a reduction in spending of down to $3.5 trillion. Now, if we don't increase the debt ceiling, instead of, again, the administration says we'll be defaulting on the debt, but I don't see how that'd be possible. According to the President's own budget, in next year, we would be still receiving $2.6 trillion worth of revenue. That's what I'd be calling the debt ceiling budget if we don't increase the debt ceiling. Now, just take a look at the graph there. What does that show? $2.6 trillion is $800 billion more than we spent just 10 years ago under Bill Clinton. It would pay for 100% of interest, which is $256 billion on the bottom there. It would pay for 100% of Social Security, which is $760 billion, and would still leave $1.6 trillion for essential defense, security, health and safety spending. And again, keep it in context, $1.6 trillion is only $200 billion less than we spent just 10 years ago. So again, that's my point, is I think it's really irresponsible for, first of all, the administration to be scaring the markets. I think it's very irresponsible for the administration not to have a plan B in case they don't get that increase in the debt ceiling.